Matt, welcome into the podcast. I want to give a quick little intro on yourself. Wrote the book Goliath, and you are very big on talking about how monopolies are not really it when it comes to the foundation of this country. And I just want to start off with your definition of what a monopoly is.
Yeah, so I director of research at a think tank called the American Economic Liberties Project, and I write a newsletter called the Big Newsletter. Um, that I also have a podcast called Organized Money, and all of it is centered around this problem of monopoly power. Now, a monopoly is there's different ways to define it, but the gist of it is that when you have some form of unified control of a recognized branch of industry or a service, that's a monopoly. Some entity or a group of entities who collectively or individually set the terms of payment, set wages, set conditions, set what kinds of products are created in an industry that we all kind of recognize as, okay, that's an industry with steel or a specific product line or certain kind of business software, whatever it is.
That standpoint, doing the research for this interview, I was really looking back at to like how this country all started with the founding fathers and the Constitution. Is this something like in hindsight you think the founding fathers were against, where it's just like too much centralized power, whether it's like in a church or in a company or in a government, is not ideal for us to kind of like progress overall?
Yeah, there was a general concern about there's a general view of okay, we have this new country and we're not going to have a king, and that was new, right? So it's like we didn't have any countries that didn't have kings at the time. So what do we do? And James Madison said, I'm going to look at every other. These guys didn't lack ambition. He said, I'm going to look at every other system of government that's ever been created, and I'm going to figure out how to make a system of government that could protect our liberties. And it's a hard thing to do, right? Because if you build a strong government, that government can take away the liberties of the people it's supposed to be representing. But if you build a weak government, then there are all sorts of other problems, like foreign entities can come and maybe take you over, or you can have domestic people who become too powerful. So what do you do? And they ultimately hit on this idea of checks and balances. They mostly focused on I think we focus at least on the political side. We say the government needs to have checks and balances. You need to have different branches of government and they check each other. But there was a commercial aspect to it as well, or a private aspect as well. Like the idea was, look, you don't want to have one state religion, right? So the different religious traditions can kind of check each other. You also had this notion that in the commercial side, you don't want to have, one entity controlling a branch of trade or business. Now, at the time, it's like the 1780s when they're writing the Constitution. We don't have industrialized power. So, you're really talking about, you're not really talking about like what we would see as industrial monopolies today, because it just wasn't possible. Things were inherently local because you have stagecoaches and things like that. That's the technology of the day. So they didn't see a need to say, okay, we're going to restrict what private entities can do. There also weren't corporate charters. Those weren't they regulated through corporate charters and said, if you're going to have a corporate charter, which were very rare, you're going to have very strict rules. So they didn't put a specific anti-monopoly rule about commerce in the Constitution, but all of the thinking about the constitutional order was oriented around making sure there were checks and balances across every layer of society. And then when the rules against monopoly sort of were formalized throughout the 19th century, but mostly in the late 19th century, Americans saw it as kind of continuous with the legal tradition of the founding of the country, as well as even earlier traditions in Anglo-American law that had to do with, restricting cornering of markets. There were medieval terms for it, but you go back and you could find precedents to all the things that we're doing to preventing monopoly that go back far beyond the founding of the country. But within the founding of the country, yeah, it's 100% right that concentrations of power were a core problem.
And to add on to that, I guess a question I have is like, I guess that they not understand the scalability of these businesses over the course of like hundreds of years, where technology right now makes everything grow exponentially. And that growth really results in, let's say, like a Jeff Bezos making hundreds of billions of dollars. Is that kind of like the point there?
Well, so if it's, it's 1793 or whatever, like if I wanted to control somebody's activity, even a town away from me, it would be impossible because I couldn't talk to them unless I spent, 3 hours walking there or riding on horseback or something. It's just not physically possible to have any sort of level of control over people who are distant from me unless I use explicit political rules through government, right? And that changed in the 19th century. You had railroads and then telegraphs and telephones. And now you have much more advanced technology that allows people to extend power all over the world through all of these really wonderful tools that we have. But it also creates the sort of the flip side, which is like, yeah, sure, you can, I can we're talking right now over a computer, and like we can have this really cool conversation and people can listen to it. And that's like a very neat thing. But it also allows to, the extension of power relationships unless we put in affirmative rules to make sure that we protect liberty.
When I was doing the research, I realized that no matter what, there has to be some sort of regulation. It can't just be a free for all. And when reading into it, when we look at like a person like Rockefeller, which had like 80% of the control of oil supply, eventually it came to a point where the government got together and decided we need to break this thing up. This guy controls every single piece in that vertical of oil. Was that the first big example of why just having this thing kind of work on its own can be detrimental to, let's say, price scalping or to really kill the competition?
Yeah. So there are many examples that you can find throughout history before Rockefeller too. So the railroads were huge. There were huge fights over railroads. Railroads have, there you can have competition. If you're going from New York to Chicago, there were different ways of getting there, so there was competition. But if you're going from like a small town through a mountain pass, usually maybe there's just one railroad to get there. Or if you're in a rural area, you have to move your crops, then there was a feeder line and you were dependent on that. Or there are granaries and things like that. So you saw huge amounts of protests and political activism in the 1870s, which is before Rockefeller. You even saw it in the 80s when you started to see kind of railroads moving around the country. So there was always fear of control of pricing. I mean, you could go back to even toll roads and like bridges. Like there's important precedent around monopoly in some early Supreme Court cases in like the 1820s or earlier around bridges and steamboats. So I think what Standard Oil, which emerged in the 1880s and was ultimately broken up in 1911, was probably the most important industrial monopoly that we've ever had, it controlling the oil industry, which was, at the time that was really important for kerosene, not gasoline, because that was before the car. But it was the most important monopoly that we had. But what Rockefeller was doing is Standard Oil was also starting, because they were so profitable, they were starting to take control of the banking system and they were taking control of other parts of our economy. And so it was really important that they got broken up. It was, I don't know. I mean, I guess you could look I mean, obviously it was a precedent setting, historically important moment. But it was continuous with, it wasn't like it was a new thing that people were like, oh, this is a completely a different thing that we've never thought about this kind of political power before. No, they had. It's just that the technology was different, the scale was different, but ultimately the solutions were consistent with what we had done previously, which was to try to decentralize power.
And would you say, historically speaking, these companies have become more intertwined with the government and just like creating their own rules, and that's the big issue?
Well, I think big business has always been a form of governance. And so I think that the dividing line that we have between government and private entities is really is blurry. And I think that's always been blurry when you're talking about, massively scaled institutions, right? So if I own a fork or I own a small piece of land or whatever it is, right, you can sort of understand that that's property that is controlled by an ordinary person. And property doesn't just mean I have dominion over it. It also means I have to take care of it. Like I'm not allowed when I have a piece of land, I'm not allowed to like put trash on it and just like put toxic waste on it. If I have obligations to my neighbors, to the community. So it also means caretaking, right? But the idea that like, Chevron is private is very different than the idea that like I have a little bit of land or I have some tools in my backyard that I can use. Chevron is a kind of quasi-private, quasi-public entity. And corporations, chartered corporations, particularly large ones, have always sat in this kind of nether region, which is they have public obligations but also there's private capital that's involved that gets a return on it. And I think a lot of the sort of the stark distinctions that we try to impute, which are like, oh, that's private, not government, doesn't make sense.
And then with the example of like Chevrolet or like Amazon, what are some main regulations in place right now to not have them gobble up a bunch of other different companies?
So there's a number of rules, but the main one that prohibits acquisitions of other companies is called the Clayton Act. And the Clayton Act was passed 19 roughly the same time as Standard Oil was broken up, so 1913 or so. And the Clayton Act says it was modified in 1950. It's been, there's occasionally changes to it, but it says that in a merger, when two companies combine or do a joint venture or other forms of sort of like quasi combinations, when that happens, if it may substantially lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly, that's the language itself, then that's illegal. And the way that you figure out, it's pretty vague language, but the way that you figure it out is the government, either through at a state level, so state attorneys general, like every state has an enforcer, or at a federal level, they're different enforcers. They bring a case in court and they say, this merger, Amazon trying to buy whoever, we think that this will substantially lessen competition or may substantially lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly. Therefore, we think that the court should prohibit it. And that is that's a thing that happens on a somewhat regular basis. So Amazon tried to buy iRobot. This is just to take Amazon, and the government didn't litigate against it, but said, we don't think this could be a problem, and so Amazon decided not to buy iRobot. I think that's the gist of what happened. But there usually what happened. I think Amazon is like gun shy about trying to buy other companies, or at least was under the Biden administration. Now I don't know anymore. But typically, the Clayton, one of the reasons we have an economy that's really dominated by monopolies is because the government has not enforced the Clayton Act for a pretty long time. They didn't really start enforcing it. They stopped enforcing it roughly around 1980. Reagan administration, they kind of only really restarted in like 2020. I mean, there's some enforcement, but like not much.
That was something I saw in your interview the other day where you're talking about from 1900s to 1970 or 1980 that there was this new theory in the 70s or 80s that said that as long as the prices are fair for like the consumer, then it shouldn't really be a concern. To kind of clarify on that, is that
Not
still
fair,
kind
but
of
low. They didn't
not
say
fair, but
it wasn't
okay.
fair. That's not the standard. What they said is if they think that, so it used to be, so prior to 1980, it would be like, all right, is one company getting too much power? Right. That was essentially the standard, right? I'm a big company. I'm going to buy a rival. Are you too powerful? And the court will sort of like judge that. And there's all sorts of technical ways to do it. But the gist of it is the court system is basically, does a reasonable person think that this is like a problem, right? That's essentially the standard, right?
Got it.
And they would say, is this company becoming too powerful? Or is this company have too many conflicts of interest, right? Like the idea is like, all right, let's say that you are a company that makes medicine. Should you also be able to buy a doctor's practice? Right. There's an obvious conflict of interest. If you make medicine and then you control a doctor's practice, you're going to want that doctor to prescribe your medicine to the patient, even if it may not be the right medicine for the patient. That would be a conflict of interest. There are many conflicts of interest. So those are the standards. Like, is it too powerful to conflict of interest? 1980, they basically said, okay, that's silly. All we need to figure out is, would this make the economy more efficient, right? And so they stopped saying, well, maybe the doctor won't prescribe the right medicine. They started saying, well, could you move the medicine more quickly if you also own the doctor? Or, maybe if this big company bought its rival, could they maybe like get rid of, they have redundant human resources department. Could they get rid of those? And then that would make things more efficient. And that was effectively a way of saying, we're going to allow a lot more mergers and we're going to allow a lot more monopolies. And so from 1980 onward, you saw this like tremendous consolidation in the economy and the creation of a lot more monopolies. That became a regular feature of business. Monopolies used to be kind of seen as like illegal. And after 1980, they were kind of seen as sort of good. And there are a bunch of laws, not just the Clayton Act, that are supposed to prohibit monopolization, but they kind of stopped enforcing them.
And in 2025, how does that currently affect, the average individual like both of us right now?
Well, I mean, it depends on who you are and what you want to buy and sell. But like effectively, the best way to understand it is like, I think everybody knows Ticketmaster, right? It's like lots of random fees. Things are super expensive. It's kind of annoying. Sometimes it doesn't work, but you have to use it because they're a monopolist, right? They control, like if you're a musician or if you're a you do some sort of performance, it's very hard to go to a venue that's not owned or controlled by Ticketmaster. It's very hard to not use their software. And so that's just kind of the way it works. They're the boss of that industry. And things, like you see like the Taylor Swift thing where like people come buy tickets or they got scammed. Like the way to understand our economy today is that's what a standard monopoly will do. And so what we're seeing across the economy is like it all is effectively kind of increasingly like Ticketmaster. So higher prices, like people bossing you around, like bad service. Cory Doctorow, who's this writer, gave a term for it when you're particularly around online platforms, which are increasingly monopolies. He called it enshittification. So just like the experience of using Facebook is worse than it used to be, or the experience of using any platform gets worse over time. There's more junk when you go on search on Google, and it's like you can't find what you're looking for. There's more fees and random crap associated with whatever it is you're buying. Where you work, you have fewer options if you want to leave your job, or there's just more control. Your boss has more control over you. Like ultimately, to understand, like we have monopolies in lots of different sectors, and a monopoly is a mini dictator. And so what we're increasingly doing is we're living in all of these, like they're a dictator over an industry, but we're living in a bunch of mini dictatorships. And that's why I think people feel like our society is less and less free, even though we still have elections, even though we still have freedom of speech, even though we have all of these freedoms, that haven't gone away. Something feels off. And that is, well, we are being subjected to much more coercive power across, but it's in commerce. And it's because people are like, oh, that commerce is different than politics because of that weird dividing line that I talked about. We don't have the language to articulate it, but really that dividing line is silly. In fact, yes, there is a lot more political coercion. It's just happening through our commercial area.
And then in the example of like Ticketmaster or like a company like Apple, how do we know when this is getting out of hand where the competition has no shot in, making a new phone like the iPhone and even remotely being comparable?
Yeah. So there's lots of different ways to understand, but basically what you have to do is say, all right, is this company in control of a recognized branch of trade or service? And if they are, it's probably because they're doing something to exclude rivals. And there's lots of tactics that companies use. Often they'll use things like, let me think about like Apple. Apple has this, what they do is they say, all right, if you want, they design their products to make them work really well with other Apple products. But if you're not an Apple product, then it's much harder for you to work well within the Apple ecosystem, or you have to do exactly what Apple says. So, for example, if you want to build like a digital watch, right, and you're not Apple, it's not going to work very well with the iPhone. But the Apple Watch works really well with the iPhone. And that's an intentional choice. Apple cripples third-party phones that want to work with its own devices. And they say, oh, it's because we want to protect our users, security, whatever, privacy. But I think you have to go into a court and do fact finding to find out, is that really the case? And they'd say the same thing about their app store. So if you want to make an app and put it on the iPhone, or buy an app and get it on the iPhone, there are really, really strict terms that Apple forces on app producers, including they take 30% a cut of the money that you pay for it. And they have clear, like you can't, have apps on your own apps. You can't, there's a bunch of things you can't do. You can't compete with Apple in certain ways. And it's like, well, if you got to look at that, you got to say, well, is that a monopoly? Is that control over an important market? And I think there's a case that the antitrust division has a case against Apple saying, yeah, that is what they are doing across a number of different areas, not just watches and the App Store, but also banking and a number of other areas they're involved in, is actually like a restraint of trade or is a monopoly. And you look at the same thing with, you could look at the same thing with all the big tech platforms. But ultimately, it's like, if you could, like if I could easily buy a different phone and switch everything that I use on my phone to that different phone, then it wouldn't necessarily be a problem. But one of the things about the Apple ecosystem is it's very, very hard to leave. And so there are lots of ways of calculating the cost of leaving that ecosystem. But ultimately, if Apple can raise prices and not lose customers because people are locked into their system, that is a really good way to define that it's a monopoly. And then if they're doing things to prevent people from buying rival products, that's a really good way to see that they're doing monopolization, which is against the law. So that's, I don't know if that answers your question, but ultimately, if someone is in control of a market and then they're using tactics to prevent rivals from entering, that's kind of what you got to look for.
No, that was really insightful. Thank you for that. So when we think about like the doomsday scenario of Apple just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, how does that look like for us? Is it just reduction in quality of the product again, and then just an increase in prices and kind of just we have to just pay whatever they want us to kind of pay for the phone?
Well, for consumers, it looks like, what we've been experiencing, which is like no one's excited for a launch of a new iPhone anymore,
Right.
right? Um, these devices are supercomputers that are attached to this incredible information network and telecom network. They should be getting better and doing really cool things, and they're not. And I remember years ago, people used to get excited to see, well, what's the new iPhone going to do? And now it's like it's not exciting because they're not innovating. And so I think what you see is this basic stagnation. I think you also see that the iPhone is addictive. And if I could buy a version of an iPhone that was not addictive, I certainly would, but I can't do that. And so it's actually making my life worse because I use it more than I should. And I can't get access to a different product that would take less of my time and my attention. And I think that's a really big problem. There are, I would think in a society, market-based society, you would see rivals entering the market saying, "Hey, our phone is just as good, but it also allows you to do things that are, not like it's not as addictive, right?"
Right.
Apple makes money when I use the iPhone in different ways, so they don't want to make that, and I think that's a really big problem. The other issue that I think we're going to see, and you saw this with the U.S. auto industry, with steel industry, with the industries themselves start to collapse. So I think one of the things that we saw with like TikTok, right, is that came from China. And it's not that the US couldn't make a short form video service. We actually made one called Vine that was very good, but they shut it down because Meta had then Facebook monopolized the ad market. And so Vine couldn't compete. And I think what ultimately we're going to see is that phones from China are ultimately going to be better than the phones here because there's actually competition in China. And so they're going to improve. It's the same thing that happened to our auto industry. It's going to wipe out our industry. So the real problem with a monopoly long term is the industry itself dies.
And what's the difference in China in terms of how do they, I guess, cultivate competition over there that's different from the States?
Well, what they do is what we really did in the 1950s. So they have a more aggressive competition regulators, and they have a weaker intellectual protection laws. So weaker patents, weaker copyright, that kind of thing. And they encourage very aggressively for companies to come into the market and try to reduce the profits of the incumbents. Whereas, in the US, where I think some of our policymakers are like, oh, it's really cool that there's these trillion-dollar companies and they're making so much money. That's like the American strength is Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, like so cool that they're worth so much money. But that's actually an indication of weakness, not strength. High persistent profit margins don't indicate that you have a competitive market. They indicate that you have a market where the monopolist is lazy. And you see that. I think Apple spends 2 or 3 times as much money sending it to investors through various techniques, dividends, buying back their own stock, those kinds of things, than they spend on research and development. And that's a real problem.
So you think like the key driver is lack of like copyright laws in China?
They have copyright laws. They're just weaker, right? They don't patents. So they just say like you can't. If I'm a company in the U.S., like in the 1950s, AT&T was this, like, they were the tech giant of the day, and they invented things like the electronic transistor and the laser and all these like cool stuff. But the government said to them, for a variety of reasons, military contracts, antitrust cases, they were like, look, you have to license all of your intellectual property, your copyrights and patents and stuff to rivals. You have to teach them how to do stuff if you want to maintain your telecommunications, your telephone business. And so they did that. And as a result, a lot of companies that came out of like that comprised Silicon Valley got were using AT&T patents. So that would be like a company called Fairchild Semiconductor, which spun off eventually like Intel came from there, and Texas Instruments and Motorola, a lot of very important companies, they came out of an environment where they could use the knowledge from AT&T to without being controlled by AT&T. And that is in many ways what's happening in China. And it isn't what's happening in the US anymore. Do something that a large company doesn't like, man, you're going to be facing down a ton of lawyers, right? And that's a way to inhibit innovation. Now, obviously, but if you're an ordinary person and you invent something, Google's going to just steal it from you. So it's not like our copyright and I mean, it's like these AI guys, like they've just taken every book they want and pirated copies and just put it into their AI models. So it's like what is happening in the US is that if you're a person who works for a living and makes things and invents things, you have no rights. If you're a monopolist that doesn't invent anything but just generates cash, you have a massive amounts of rights. And I think in China, I don't want to romanticize it. I just think they're a little bit less imbalanced than we are right now.
For the last piece, I wanted to ask you in terms of the research you're doing with your company, can you walk us through some of the things that you are trying to help people with?
Sure. So what I just write about, I'm a business writer. So what I try to do is look at different sectors of the economy and describe why there are distortions or why they work well. So I guess the last big investigation that I did was on this company called Primo Brands. They are, like they basically deliver water coolers. I know it's like a niche area. Some people like to have water coolers, gyms, to affluent people who just like want to have a water cooler in their house. That's been so every domestic bottled water brand has been rolled up by Primo Brands, and their service has gone to crap. So that's what's going on and I sort of just like did a bunch of interviews and looked at a bunch of documents and found, oh yeah, this is true. It's been monopolized. The prices have gone up. The service has gone down, and wrote that up. I also, that's the kind of thing that I do. This is true. I had a writer who wrote something up showing that like fire trucks have been monopolized, which is one of the reasons why half of the fire trucks in Los Angeles were out of service when you had the LA wildfires. I track the antitrust cases. So the government is going to have like next month in August, there's going to be a judge is going to hand down a decision in Google and say, all right, we're going to restructure the company. So I write about that. It's like a media outlet. It's like a magazine, right? So, and yeah, I have a lot of people who subscribe, a lot of antitrust people, judges and whatnot, who are subscribers to it. But it's like, it's like any magazine, people can read it, right? It's public.
Your idea is get the information out there, and then individuals, whether it's in the government or judges, can kind of decipher what to do with that company.
It's like that's the premise of like a public media, right? Is you put it out there and the public takes it, learns, uses it in whatever way they see fit, and that's what I do. That's how I try to affect things.
Amazing. Well, Matt, I really appreciate your time, and thank you again so much for this.
Hey, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.